Stepdad tried to steal my $4 million inheritance, so I did this and make him homeless. People say money changes everything. That if you suddenly inherit millions of dollars, life becomes easy, problems disappear, and everything turns into a dream come true. But that's a lie. Because money doesn't just change your life, it changes the people around you. It brings out their true colors. And sometimes, it turns them into monsters. I learned that the hard way. My mother always told me, family should protect each other. I believed her. Because she did. She protected me every single day from the moment I was born. But when she died, I was left with a man who only protected himself. Greg became my stepfather when I was 10. He wasn't cruel, exactly. Not at first. He didn't hit me or yell at me. He just didn't care. I was nothing to him, just a leftover piece of my mother's life. And his real priority was his biological son, Brandon, the golden child, the one who got everything he ever wanted. Brandon was spoiled beyond belief. New clothes, expensive electronics, private tutors. And me? I got leftovers, hand-me-downs, a seat at the dinner table where nobody asked about my day, a room in a house that never felt like home. The only people who ever truly loved me were my mother and grandparents. But life has a way of taking away the people you need most. And in one horrific accident, they were gone. I was 17 when my world collapsed. My mother, my grandparents, all taken from me in an instant. And the only person I had left was Greg. I sat across from him in the lawyer's office, numb, broken, unable to process the words being spoken. Your grandparents' estate has been left entirely to you. The assets are valued at approximately $4 to $5 million. I blinked. I had expected nothing. I had assumed my mother and grandparents had modest savings, maybe enough for college. But millions? That didn't make sense. Until the lawyer explained. Your grandfather was a private investor. He had multiple properties, stock market assets, and life insurance policies, all of which are now yours. I barely heard him, because across the table, Greg's entire demeanor changed. His shoulders stiffened, his eyes darkened, and for the first time in my life, I saw the real him. He wasn't grieving. He wasn't thinking about my mother or my pain. He was thinking about the money. The lawyer continued, "There is one condition. Since you are still a minor, the assets will remain under the supervision of your legal guardian until you turn 18. A cold chill crawled up my spine. And who is my legal guardian? The lawyer hesitated. Your stepfather. Greg smiled. And that was when I knew I was in serious trouble. Because Greg had just been handed control of millions of dollars. And if I knew anything about him, he wasn't going to let it go easily. At first, he played the loving parent. He started checking in on me. Are you okay? Do you need anything? He started buying me small gifts, making me my favorite meals. He started acting like he was the father I never had. Even Brandon, who had never spoken a kind word to me, suddenly started treating me like we were best friends. And I saw right through it. Because Greg wasn't comforting me. He was grooming me, softening me up, making me feel like I owed him something. And when he thought I was finally ready, he made his move. One night, over dinner, he swirled his wine glass like he was making some grand declaration. Handling this kind of money is a huge responsibility, he said. And well, you're still just a kid. I put my fork down. What's your point? He gave me a fatherly smile. You don't have experience with finances. You might make mistakes, lose it all. But lucky for you, I do. His tone was gentle, almost reassuring. But his eyes were hungry. I think it's best if you sign everything over to me, he said. And that was when my grief turned to rage. I met his eyes, unblinking. No. Greg's smile froze. Excuse me? I leaned forward. You're not getting a single cent of my inheritance. His face darkened, and for the first time, his mask slipped. You ungrateful little brat. Brandon scoffed from across the table. Wow, so much for family. I ignored him, because Greg was just getting started. He tried everything, guilt-tripping me, twisting my mother's memory, manipulating me with fake concern. I took care of you after your mother died. I let you live in MY house, eat MY food. while I handled everything. Without me, you'd have nothing. But no matter what he said, I stood my ground, because I had finally realized the truth. Greg never took care of me. Greg never cared about me. He was just waiting for his payday. And now that it was slipping through his fingers, he was desperate. I barely slept that night, because deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Greg wasn't the type to give up easily. And if he couldn't convince me to give him the money willingly, then he was going to try and take it by force. And I had to be ready for him, because the fight for my inheritance had only just begun. Greg thought he could wear me down, that if he pushed hard enough, if he kept applying pressure, I'd crack, that I'd hand over my inheritance just to make it stop. But what he didn't realize was that I had already made up my mind, and I wasn't going to break. The next morning, Greg switched tactics. He was no longer friendly, no longer trying to be the supportive father figure. Now, he was using fear. The first sign? He started controlling everything. My bank card mysteriously stopped working. My phone bill went unpaid, leaving me with no way to call for help. Even my car keys disappeared. "You don't need to be going anywhere right now," Greg said, his voice eerily calm. "You should be focusing on your future." "My future?" I asked, my patience running thin. He smiled. "Yes, and I think we both know what that means." Translation? Give me the money, and I'll give you your life back. But Greg had underestimated me, because I wasn't helpless. I had been preparing for this, and while he was trying to trap me inside his little kingdom, I was laying the groundwork to destroy him. The first thing I did, I called my lawyer. Using my school's office phone, I explained what was happening. He was furious. "Legally, Greg has no right to withhold your personal accounts. I'll have an emergency motion filed immediately." But that wasn't all. Because Greg thought he was safe. That because I was under his roof, he still had power over me. But the truth? I had been planning to leave for weeks. And now it was time. That night, while Greg and Brandon were asleep, I packed my things. I had been quietly transferring important documents, birth certificates, my mother's personal files, even family photos, out of the house. I had already rented a small apartment across town, paid for entirely with my own savings. And as I zipped up my bag, I felt nothing but relief. Because after years of feeling trapped in that house, I was finally leaving. And Greg? He had no idea. The next morning, I left before sunrise. I took a rideshare to my new place, used the spare key waiting in my mailbox, and stepped into my first real home. A small one-bedroom, unfurnished, bare, but mine. And that was all that mattered. Hours later, Greg called. Over, and over, and over. Then the text started. "Greg, where are you? Greg, this isn't funny. Greg, you better get your ass home now." I didn't reply. Then, he left a voicemail, and his tone had completely changed. "I know what you're doing," Greg hissed. "You think you're smart? You think you can just leave?" He laughed, cold, bitter, full of rage. "You have nothing without me. No job, no family, no support. You will come crawling back?" I played the message twice, and then I deleted it, because Greg was nothing to me, and I was finally free. But I knew Greg wasn't done. He wasn't going to just let me go. And if I knew him like I thought I did, he was about to make one last desperate move, one that would finally destroy him, and I would be waiting. Greg was desperate, and desperate men make stupid mistakes. I had escaped his control. I had taken everything he wanted away from him, and now he was about to make his final move, one that would end him for good. It started with an official letter from his lawyer, a petition filed in court. Greg was trying to gain access to my inheritance, for household expenses, for the well-being of my stepdaughter, to ensure her future is financially stable. I almost laughed reading it. Greg, caring about my future? What a joke. My lawyer called me immediately. "We have a problem," he said. I stayed calm. "No, Greg has a problem. We have a strategy." Because Greg thought this court case would be his golden ticket, that he could convince a judge that I was too young, too irresponsible to handle my money. But what he didn't know was that I had been preparing for this. And by the time he walked into that courtroom, he was already a dead man walking. The day of the hearing, Greg arrived smug and confident, dressed in an expensive suit, despite claiming he was in financial distress. His lawyer was a shark, ready to paint me as an ungrateful, reckless teenager. But then, it was our turn, and we buried him. Step 1. Exposing his lies. My lawyer stood and handed the judge a thick file. Bank statements, luxury purchases, proof of expensive vacations and high-end shopping trips, all while Greg was claiming he was barely making ends meet. The judge frowned, flipping through the pages. "Mr. Gregg, can you explain these expenditures?" Greg shifted in his seat. "Those were necessary investments." The judge's eyebrow raised. "A Rolex is a necessary investment?" Greg's face paled. Step 2. Proving he never cared about me. We pulled out text messages and emails. Messages from Greg to Brandon, mocking me, calling me a spoiled brat, saying he was waiting for the payday. Once he got control of the money, Greg gripped the table so hard his knuckles turned white. His lawyer whispered something urgently to him, but the damage was already done, because now the judge saw him for what he was, a greedy, manipulative fraud. Step 3. The final blow. We showed Greg's recent mortgage application. He had been planning to take out a massive loan, using my inheritance as collateral. The judge's jaw clenched. And Greg looked like he was about to vomit. Because now, the case wasn't just about his greed. It was about fraud. And fraud had serious consequences. The ruling was swift. The petition is denied. Furthermore, Mr. Gregg is permanently stripped of any financial authority over the inheritance. Additionally, his financial activities will be reported for potential fraud investigation. Silence. Then, what? Greg shot out of his chair. His face was red with fury. "You can't do this." I raised her. The judge glared. "Sit down, Mr. Gregg, before I hold you in contempt." Greg sat, because for the first time in his pathetic life, he had lost. I walked out of that courtroom victorious, and Greg walked out a broken man. But this was just the beginning, because I wasn't just taking my inheritance back. I was going to take everything else from him, too. And soon, Greg was going to lose more than just the money. He was going to lose the very roof over his head. Greg thought the court case was the worst thing that could happen to him. He thought losing control of my inheritance was the end of it. But what he didn't realize, I wasn't just fighting to protect my money. I was going to take everything from him. And by the time I was done, Greg would be left with nothing. After the court ruling, Greg was in full meltdown mode. His texts? Unhinged. His voicemails? Hysterical. He went from furious rants to begging in a matter of days. "Greg, you think you're so smart, don't you? Greg, this isn't over. Greg, please, let's talk. I made some mistakes, but I can fix this." I ignored them all, because while Greg was spiraling, I was planning. Because he wasn't just going to lose my money. He was going to lose everything he ever took for granted. Step 1. Bleeding him dry. Greg had no backup plan. He had lived his life assuming he would always land on his feet. But now, he was drowning in debt. With his gambling habits, unpaid loans, and reckless spending, Greg was in way over his head. And the best part? I had every intention of making it worse. Using the legal records from the court case, I tipped off debt collectors about Greg's financial situation. Turns out, he owed money to multiple lenders. And now that his big payday, aka my inheritance, was gone, they were coming for him. Fast. It started with his car. One morning, I drove past his house and saw it. A repo truck. His precious, overpriced SUV, gone. Next, his credit cards were frozen. Without access to my money, he had nothing left to cover his bills. He started missing payments. And once that happened, everything collapsed. And me? I just watched. Because this was exactly what he deserved. Step 2. Taking his house. Greg had always looked down on me. He made it clear I wasn't really part of his family. I was just a burden, an inconvenience. He let me stay in his house, made me feel like I owed him something for having a roof over my head. But the reality? That house had originally belonged to my mother. She had purchased it before she met Greg, and when she passed, Greg inherited it. Or so he thought. Because after a little digging, I found something interesting. The house was still in my mother's name, meaning it should have been mine. And now, I was taking it back. I hired a real estate lawyer and filed a legal claim. Since Greg never formally transferred ownership and my mother's estate had now been legally settled, the house was still technically part of my inheritance. Greg had no legal right to it, and when the court sided with me, he was served an eviction notice. The day the sheriff showed up was glorious. Greg was livid. "You can't do this," he screamed. "This is my home." I just stood there, arms crossed, watching as he realized it was over. "No, Greg, this was never your home. You just lived here like a parasite." The officers gave him 30 minutes to gather his things. And after years of treating me like an outsider in my own house, now it was him being thrown out. And me? I finally had what was rightfully mine. But Greg? He still had one last card to play. Because when a man like him loses everything, he either gives up or he self-destructs. And Greg chose the latter. Greg had nothing left. No car, no money, no house. Everything he had stolen, manipulated, and schemed for was gone. And the best part? I didn't have to lift a finger. I just let karma do its job. But Greg? He still thought he could turn it around. He still thought he could win. And what he did next proved just how desperate he really was. After the eviction, Greg and Brandon were officially homeless. I thought maybe they'd find some motel, crash at a friend's place, or even leave town altogether. But Greg? He had one last trick up his sleeve. Instead of accepting defeat, he blamed me, and he wanted revenge. It started with phone calls. From random numbers, unknown callers. I ignored them at first, but then I started getting messages. "You're a selfish little brat. Your mother would be ashamed of you. You think you've won? Just wait." At first, I assumed it was Greg, but after a few days, I got a message that made my blood boil. "I always knew you were a fake. You don't deserve a cent of that money." It was from Brandon. The same Brandon who had treated me like trash for years. The same Brandon who had mocked me, bullied me, stolen from me. Now he was furious that I had taken back what was rightfully mine. And he wasn't just angry. He was obsessed. At first, I thought they were just trying to rattle me. That once the shock wore off, they'd disappear. But then, I got a call from my landlord. "Hey, there's been someone hanging around the building, asking about you." I felt my stomach drop. "Who?" "Middle-aged guy, rough-looking, angry. Kept saying he needed to talk to you." I didn't need to guess. I knew exactly who it was. Greg. And that's when I knew this wasn't over. I knew Greg was spiraling. I knew he had lost everything. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind of man. So, I decided to end this, once and for all. The next day, I went to meet him. Not alone. My lawyer and a security guard were with me. Greg was waiting outside a gas station, looking worse than I had ever seen him. His clothes were dirty, his face was unshaven, and his smug arrogance was completely gone. He looked like a broken man, but the moment he saw me, the rage returned. "You," he spat, stepping forward. "You ruined my life." I didn't flinch. "You ruined your own life, Greg." His hands shook with anger. "Everything was fine before you started acting like a spoiled little brat. I took care of you. I raised you." I laughed. "No, Greg. You tolerated me. And now, I don't have to tolerate you anymore." He clenched his jaw, eyes wild. "You owe me. After everything I did for you." I cut him off. "You never did anything for me." Silence. Then, I took a deep breath and said the words I had been waiting to say for years. "Greg, you're nothing. You always have been. And now, the whole world sees it." He opened his mouth, then closed it, because for the first time, he had no comeback. No lie, no manipulation, just the cold, brutal truth. Greg had lost, and I had won. I turned to leave, and as I walked away, I heard his voice, small, weak, pathetic. "You'll regret this." I smiled. "No, Greg, I won't." And then, I left. For good. Greg had lost, but he still didn't get it. Even after the court case, after being evicted, after losing his car, his money, his so-called friends, he still thought he could win, still thought he could get back at me. But what he did next, that was the moment he sealed his fate. A few days after our last confrontation, I thought Greg had finally given up. No more calls, no more texts, no more stalking my building. I assumed he had finally accepted defeat. But then, I got a call from my lawyer, and what he said made my blood boil. Greg tried to contest the inheritance again. I nearly dropped my phone. Are you joking? My lawyer sighed. Nope. He filed another motion, claiming you manipulated the will. I actually laughed, because Greg had officially lost his damn mind. The case had already been closed. The judge had ruled in my favor. And now Greg was trying to argue that I had somehow cheated? That the will was fake? That he was the rightful heir to my family's money? It was pathetic, and even his own lawyer knew it. My lawyer continued. The judge dismissed it immediately. But Greg isn't stopping. He's still trying to file claims. I clenched my jaw. He's desperate. Yep. And since his legal fees are stacking up, I'd say he's also an idiot. That made me smirk. Greg had no job, no money, no house, and now he was drowning in legal debt, which meant he was screwed. But then, Greg made his worst mistake yet, because after losing in court again, he tried to ruin my reputation. It started with social media. He created fake accounts, spreading lies about me, claiming I was a greedy, spoiled liar, that I had manipulated my mother's will, that I had cheated him out of his rightful inheritance. He even posted fake documents trying to prove it. He wanted people to turn against me, to make me the villain. But there was just one problem. Greg had no credibility. Nobody believed him. Not the public, not the court, not even the few friends he had left. Because Greg was nothing more than a bitter, broke, homeless scammer. And all he had left was his own self-pity. The final nail in his coffin came a few weeks later, when I got another call from my lawyer. You're going to love this. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, he chuckled. Greg officially filed for bankruptcy. I grinned. Perfect. Because now, Greg had lost everything, and there was no coming back. A few months passed. Greg had disappeared. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. Even Brandon had vanished. And me? I had moved on. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about Greg. I wasn't worried about losing my inheritance. I wasn't worried about him taking anything from me ever again. Because now, he had nothing left to take. And I had everything I had ever fought for. Freedom, independence, a life that was finally mine. And Greg was nothing more than a forgotten memory. But before I closed this chapter for good, I had one last thing to do. One final act of revenge. One last way to prove to Greg that he had never, ever stood a chance against me. And after this, he would never dare come near me again.